If you'd like to put a title on your message here tonight, I've titled the message, "The Ball's in Your Court." It almost sounds like it's a fight between a husband and a wife, you know. It's like, the ball's in your court now, you know. But we are on the wrap down here of Ecclesiastes. You know, we've got next week and then we're done with this. But I want to remind us of a couple things here. And, you know, as we've gotten through Ecclesiastes, remember, as some of Solomon's initial claims as we got going in the book and everything that he began to share is that, you know, he talked about how useless life was. And man, there are so many people within our society that have the same vantage point. And maybe even if you're a Christian here tonight, maybe you found yourself at times moving into that place of saying, oh man, life is so frustrating. You know, life is there any point to all of this? And so these are real factors. These are real things that happen. And Solomon addressed this stuff. He addressed the real struggle. And as he categorized the struggle, he said, and he used that phrase, not only vanity of vanities, but he continued to address all through the early phases of Ecclesiastes about life under the sun. And if you'll remember with me, that life under the sun, the distinctive phrase there was speaking about life apart from God. It was life in the natural world and everything that was pertained within the natural world. And you know, the amounting of it was just nothing more than meaninglessness and frustration and all of these things. And he went on, and we saw as the early chapters unfold that Solomon began to talk about how unsatisfying the routines of life were. He began to talk about the pursuits of wisdom, the pursuits of accomplishment, all of these things that he was trying to pour meaning into and trying to capture some satisfaction. You know, I remember the old song when I was coming up in high school, you know, I can't get no satisfaction. And I better be careful about singing that song because I don't remember all the details of that, but surely it's not a good song, you know. But that's kind of was his heart, man. It's like, man, I can't get no satisfaction. And everything is so unsatisfying. And then he reached a climatic point there early on, and he came right down to that point of saying that not only can I not get satisfaction, but the summation and the totality of life is such a waste because it ends in death. And everything that I work to accomplish, I got to leave it to somebody else. And who knows what type of individual that guy is going to be or not be. Who knows? Now, if we look on the other side, though, because as he's migrated through these chapters, we find that there's been a little bit of a turn, maybe about chapter 7, and start working our way up in chapter 8 and all this stuff. And the turn is, it speaks of him bringing in God to the equation. And as he brings God into the equation, what happens? Well, he realizes three things. The first thing is that life is filled with routines. Amen to that. I mean, I got to get up and brush my teeth and comb my hair, what little bit I have left, and, you know, make the bed and eat and do all these particular things. Yes, there are routines of life, for sure. But once he brought God into the equation, he realized that the routines of life, that each one of the situations that God has a plan in. And that's an encouraging part for us. And Christian, I want to remind you that, you know, it's a verse that you know, Romans 8:28, that all things work together for good to those that love God, to those that are called according to his purposes. And these are some of the things that when it comes to the mundane factors of life, or even Romans chapter 5, verses 3 and 4, when it comes to the struggles in life, that we remember these things, that it's the very fingerprints of God as we go through the struggles, that God is using that to build us up and to give us character and to help us to persevere. And he leads us to a place of hope. Why? Why hope? The scripture says that hope doesn't disappoint, but in the aspect of the hope is that these things are leading us to God. And that we're walking along these things, God's handprints upon us is changing us. And he's like literally expanding the borders of our heart, causing us to be conformed to the image of Christ and changing us step by step as we go. And I hope that you can give that testimony in your life tonight. That you can look back in your life from the day that you got saved or from last year, or maybe it's even, for me, it seems like it's, you know, I was just telling Justin this in the back room. Gosh, it just seems like it's a day-by-day thing that God is doing this and God is doing that. And it's so awesome. But it seems like the more that I learn about God and the more that God is stretching my heart and more that God is doing this and revealing and taking this away and adding this back and doing all of this stuff, the more I realize it's like, oh man, Lord, I thought I had some of this together and I don't, you know, not in a bad, frustrated way. I don't mean it like that, okay? I mean it by like, oh, my little two sides of my brain just are just blowing up. It's like, oh, God, you're awesome. Well, the second thing that he takes on that other hand, and you know, as he vented all of these negative things, when he brings God into it, he realized that the pursuits of life that we go through and the things that we do, that they absolutely can be used to honor God and to serve other people. To honor God and to serve other people. Listen, it is no secret around here that, you know, about 4 years ago I started doing some exercise stuff, and I think I started reluctantly here on, must have been after Mother's Day. My wife wanted to go out and get, you know, these bicycles from Dick's Sporting Goods about 4 years ago or so. Right at 4 years ago, am I right? Okay. And I didn't really want to do that. I felt comfortable. You know, there was no need for me to go out and get a bicycle and start riding. But it's so funny that God has changed my heart towards that. And man, he's enlarged it and he's given me some new opportunities. But man, learning how to honor God in that. That literally every time before Jody and I go out, we do this a couple times a week. This is our little exercise program that we do. We spend about an hour riding our bicycles there. But we honor God in that at the start of it. And we ask God not only to protect us, but to be with us. And that's redeeming something. And what Solomon has learned is that when he brought God into the equation here, that he learned that the pursuits of life can be used to honor God and to bless other people. You and I know this now because we talk about the very Proverbs that Solomon wrote, and we get into Proverbs chapter 3, verse number 6, and we know, okay, we're supposed to acknowledge God in all of our ways, and we're really good at quoting the verse, but then it gets down to the practicality. Well, how do I bring God into my situations? How do I bring him into the very present moment? Well, I think it starts very simply by just asking him, Lord, be with me in this, man. You know, just like you're talking to, you know, somebody else, you talk to the Lord like that. And the third thing is this, that on the good side there, that Solomon, again, you know, as he stated early on, there's no way to avoid death, but what he found is that the eternal focus, that by having an eternal focus, that he can be thankful for the moments and that he can be grateful for the opportunities that God gives. And I like that. I like what he learned, and I think that's something for me to soak up, because being thankful for the moments, I don't know what the pace and the pulse is of your life, but when I look across the spectrum of our society, people are overwhelmed. There's a lot of burdens on people's lives. The pace of life is super fast. The responsibilities, it seems like they overshadow us so quickly. And I'm one of those guys that I don't know. I've done this since my youth. You know, I lay in bed at night and I shake with my legs. You know, not something weird like I got a problem, but it's just I just rock my foot back and forth, and my little brain is like going like this. You know, in learning how to relax and to enjoy the moment of where God has me right now, that's a challenge for me. And I mean, I still do the same thing when I don't drink coffee. And I've been cutting back on coffee, by the way, for the past couple months I have. But enjoying the moment and being grateful for the opportunities. Let's think about this for a second. Let's think about the opportunity. I'm going to use this phrase. Whether it fits or it doesn't fit, I don't care. But you'll get the idea. You know, when we left the rec center on the other side of Wadsworth, when we came over here, we lost about a quarter or a third of the church just moving from there to here. Because folks didn't want to move from the small, friendly context of the rec center over to this. This was intimidating to some people. Pastor, we like our church. There's no reason to change it. Well, it's important to be grateful for the moments, but it's also important to move on to the next step of what God has, for sure. And walking and making sure that we don't lose sight of where we are and where we're going. Something that is super important. And I would encourage you guys tonight, even as you sit in your chairs here right now, that this sweet little fellowship that the Lord has given to us by way of interaction with other people, our proximity, the resources that God has put within this fellowship for us as his people, not only to enjoy, but to bless others with and all that, it's amazing. And I think that one of the things that we neglect is that gratitude of heart for what we have right in the moment. I don't know what you're looking for in a church. Some of you guys are visitors, some of you are regulars here. I don't know what you're looking for. In many days, it feels like, I pass to the church, it's like, well, what am I looking for? I'm not looking for anything. But learning to rest in what God has already done and what God has already given is really a struggle. And I think it's because, we're so inflated on the next biggest and the next greatest thing that the routines of life can pass us by, and the simplicity of our Christian faith and the simplicity of our walk with Jesus can be so diluted or even complicated maybe on the other end of the spectrum. And so what Solomon learned through all of this stuff, that as he had these three particular questions regarding the pursuits and the routines and death at the end and all of this stuff, he found that once he began to think about it from God's point of view, or bringing God into the equation, if you will, the expression and the thoughts of his heart, his mind, his emotion, they began to open up in a much better way, and he moved in to something positive. Now, I bring all that to your attention just nothing more than by way of introduction to these last two chapters. And so our tonight, we're only going to have two simple points. Our first point is this. Point number one is investment. Investment. And this covers verses 1 through 6. And we're going to find here in verses 1 and 2 that we're going to get this picture of, it's maritime trade. It's on the sea trading and all of this stuff. And let me just read the verse, and then I'll come back and magnify it a little bit. Verse 1 and 2, it says, "Cast your bread upon the waters, for you will find it after many days. Give a serving to 7 and also to 8, for you do not know what evil will be on the earth." Now, listen, I want to remind you once again, we've been in wisdom literature here now for months. We're at the end of all of the wisdom literature, and I'm excited about being done and moving on to teaching 1 Samuel. Super excited. But when you read these things once and again, please recognize and please realize that the words that he's giving here and the way that he's describing this stuff is not something that you and I would put in a text and we would send to our friend. They would read it and go, "What? Cast my bread upon the waters? I just got this thing from the store. Why am I going to throw it in the bathtub?" You know what I'm saying? What in the world does this mean? Well, listen, Solomon is writing this, and we know this, that all the way back in 1 Kings chapter 10, verse 22, that there in that there was another queen, I think her name was Sheba, that she came to visit Solomon. And his wealth, his fame, his knowledge, everything, he became world renowned in all this stuff. And one of the things that they used to do is the merchant trading, the maritime trading, right? They would send the ships of grain out and to trade with others, and they would be gone. This is not like a day trip or a week trip. This is months. The ships would be on the open water for months. And then when they would come back, and the rotating of the fleet and how all that happened is they would bring back in the silver and the gold and the different possessions and all of this stuff. And so casting your bread upon the waters, it literally had the meaning of sending your grain ships out. This is very specifically, it's speaking about an investment of faith in a very practical matter as to what he did. And so as he's using and he's looking at the natural man and natural life and all of these things, he's coming down not to a pessimistic view, but to a hopeful view. And the hopeful view that he gives us here out of these two particular verses is that, man, it's like this. It's like, hey, look around, gang, and use the resources that God has put within your hands, that God has put within your life. What are those resources? Is it a resource of health? Is it a resource of time? Is it a resource of a certain type of professions or a skill? Whatever it is. And as he says, cast your bread upon the waters, for you will find it after many days. And it's so strange, and it's so funny to watch that there are those that maybe have been blessed with X, Y, and Z, and they become hoarders of stuff. And you see the end of what happens to the heart as a heart would shrink and shrivel. Well, that's not the encouragement that we have. We have the encouragement to walk these things out in faith. But I think it's important for us to remember that when we're talking about the investment of our lives, I think it's important for us to understand and to recognize that nobody knows what the future brings. By show of hands in this room, who can tell me what tomorrow brings? Or what next month brings? What next year brings? Will there be a next year? All of these particular questions. I think we can safely agree that nobody knows. And this is what he says at the end of verse number 2b. He says, "For you do not know what evil will be on the earth." You don't know. So 3 caution points, or 3 extremes, if you will, that we can stay away from. Number 1 is this, is that if we begin to make decisions based upon fear, okay, because we're talking about steps of faith here. He's talking about casting your bread. He's talking about using the resources. He's talking about, these investments. But the investments need to be made by faith, okay? He was making a bigger decision here than what you and I are making. But an extreme to avoid is making decisions based on fear. And what does a decision based on fear look like? Let's give some natural examples, something that everyone in this room can relate to. If I was to use the phrase Y2K, do you remember what that phrase stood for, right? If I was to use that phrase, maybe a more current phrase, preppers. Do we know what that phrase means? Preppers, a little less on that one, okay? Modern day preppers. Let's take the Y2K, the turning from 1999 to 2000, and the stockpiling of stuff, and let's advance it forward to 2018 and what folks are doing now, submerged bunkers and, buying all this supplies and all this stuff and everything. This is an example, if you will, of people making decisions based upon fear. The whole world is in God's hand and all the details, and we know that all the struggles in life that they are, they've been consistent from the days of antiquity to this very current moment. And stockpiling and hoarding things to self. This is an example of an extreme, and this is an example of fear. And I don't know if you know anybody that's real deep into, modern day prepping and all that stuff, but if you interact with somebody, if you know somebody personally, or you know a number of people personally, sometimes it can feel like you're having a conversation with somebody that is just, quite frankly, out of this world. It's like, what, dude? Do you know what the government is doing? No, I don't care, I'm looking for Jesus, Amen. And so that's one crazy example. But let's add another example to that, okay? Because you have other folks that, another sort of extreme would be carelessness. Just complete carelessness. There's no thought, there's no discipline, there's no responsibility. They basically live life in a reckless capacity. And we all know what this looks like. Okay, so let me dump the phrases out there. Let's start with a biblical phrase here, maybe coming out of Luke. Okay, we've got a prodigal son there, right? Wasteful living. Okay, let's move that a little bit farther. Maybe it's uncomfortable here in this one that we talk about this one. Oh, what about the transients that are finding their way at a greater and greater capacity around our city, the city of Denver, around our community here, even in Westminster, around the on and off ramp just at the top of the hill, the commotion. I tell you, I think it's a ring of people up there that are doing this because they got them on rotations and you see them now, they come out there with lawn chairs and sunglasses and they're just kicking it and smoking cigarettes and drinking bottles of water, and it's like they're waiting there to catch a bus or something, just hanging out. It's going. Literally, Jody and I just saw this on, must have been this past Friday. We're sitting there at an off-ramp up here at Flatirons and pull up and we see these folks sitting there and we're going, these guys have been here for a while. They sure look pretty good. They got some good-looking shoes on, too. What are they doing? And then that's not to down people with a real, genuine need. But here is the point. And the point is clear. This is an extreme. Whether it's making a decision out of fear or moving to this place to where we're exercising our life in a careless capacity, where no responsibility, no discipline, no thought, no nothing. All of these things are real. And I want to be careful with adding this onto it, but this applies in some capacity. We talked about prodigals, we talked about transients. Okay, let's get a little bit more uncomfortable with this, okay? Again, we're just putting some skin on this. Maybe we can move it to the place and we can remember the culture of the 60s, and maybe we can upgrade that because I don't know how frequently you're in Boulder, but I go to Boulder. There's a lot of great residents in Boulder, but there's also some folks that are from out of this world, and they're holding to a hippie lifestyle, and it's like no responsibility, pushing off of everything, and all of this stuff. And it's like, dude, I'm talking to somebody from a different world right now. Carelessness, That's an extreme that we want to avoid. And the final thing that we want to avoid, and this one strikes closer to my, not my household, but relatives, family members that Jody and I have, it's becoming paralyzed. A paralyzed person, they don't hoard. They're not living their life recklessly or anything like that. But they let time and they let opportunity pass by, and year by year it goes. It comes and it goes, and it comes and it goes, and there's no plans, there's no changes, there's no direction. And what ends up happening? The individual just ends up living their life enduring the moment, waiting for the end to happen. And gang, that is not how we are to invest our life. The way that we are to invest our life, and the practical takeaway that we can draw out and we can extract by way of application is, he says, cast your bread upon the waters, for you will find it after many days. Give a servant to 7 and also to 8, for you do not know what evil will be on the earth. Is going and being intentional about investing in your life, investing in your family, investing in other people, in taking your resources and using them for good, and making some sort of plans. I want to be careful because I don't want to go too cliche, and I'm not looking to use worldly philosophies or anything like that. I'm just not. I think that's lame. I think it's inappropriate for us as the Christian community to live our lives that way. But the skinny file comes back to is that if we don't make any plans or any preparations, and we end up finding ourselves, at a dead end or in a ditch because we haven't done anything with it, it's not because God hasn't wanted to help. And that's the thrust that I want to make sure that I give to us, is that God does desire to help, and that God does desire to bless us. But it does require for us to look to the Lord and to take some steps of preparation. The plans of the heart, who do they belong to? It belongs to man. It's the steps that are given from God. And so, investing our life. Now, moving down into verses 3, 4, 5, 6, okay, so he takes this from a merchant trader on the ocean, okay, and he transitioned this over to a farmer. Look at verse number 3. He says this. He says that if the clouds are full of rain, they empty themselves upon the earth. And if a tree falls to the south or the north, in the place where the tree falls, there it shall lie. I don't see any problem with that. If the clouds are up there and they look dark, okay, there's probably some rain in those suckers. And if a tree falls over, whether it falls to the south, the north, the east, or the west, hey, listen, if that tree falls over, it's down. A tree ain't going to get back up and put itself back together and begin to go again. Okay, so what are you saying? I think it's very simple. Listen, let's use a little bit of common sense. Yeah, okay. I like that, common sense. Warren Wiersbe said this about this particular verse. He said, don't sit around waiting for an ideal circumstance. I love that. Because now he's beginning to put some meat on the bones here for us as we go through this. Because we are talking about moving through the natural life, the natural process, understanding that God's in control, but there's a very real, tangible thing. Listen, when we get up in the morning, you can lay in your bed and pray all day, God, help me get dressed, help me put my clothes on. But until you slide your foot out of bed and walk over to the closet to get something, God's just going to look at you and wait for you. Come on, let's get our clothes on today, okay? Do you understand the hyperbole I'm putting behind that, okay? I understand I'm making a very radical distinction there in that, but I'm using the hyperbole just so that we understand this. So don't sit around waiting for ideal circumstances. Why? Because life is difficult, and there's a lot of struggles that are attached to it. Look what he says in verse 4. He says, he who observes the wind will not sow, and he who regards the clouds will not reap. Listen, if you take note of everything that you see, and you begin to say, oh, there's a lion in the road, I can't go outside today. And you begin to live your life looking for those perfect and ideal circumstances, you're going to waste everything that you've been given, because life is challenging, life is tough, and it's very rarely that the ideal circumstances line up right before you. You can try to be hyper-spiritual if you want and say, well, if it's God's perfect will, it's going to be perfect and all this stuff. And then we got to open up the New Testament, we got to begin to talk about the disciples and everything that they went through. And then we suddenly realize, well, okay, well, maybe not. It's maybe not exactly perfect, okay? There might be a little bit of a struggle in this. And God uses the struggle. There's always going to be risk. But in the middle of the risk, the scriptures call us to a place to trust in God. Yes, we trust God with the salvation of our soul, for there is no other. Jesus, he's the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes to the Father but by him. Yes, we trust him with our soul. But we are also to trust him with the care of our life. And the overshadowing aspect of what Solomon saw, what he observed in his kingdom and his experiences on life, and moving from this place of pessimism and building up and asking all these questions and then bringing God into the equation and then coming down here on this downward slide here to his ultimate conclusion, which we'll see next week, that there was a turning and there was a hope. And man, I hope to give you some hope here tonight. Turn with me in the Gospel of Matthew to Matthew chapter 6. Many of you will recognize this coming behind the Beatitudes and as being as part of the Sermon on the Mount. And I think we can quickly overlook this, but Jesus, as he speaks, he gives the cure for anxiety. And part of this cure for anxiety, if you will, is that he speaks to the reality of the natural world that we live in and the natural needs that we have. Look with me, verse 31. Jesus would say, after speaking to a number of things here, he says, therefore do not worry, saying, what shall we eat, or what shall we drink, or what shall we wear? Jesus is saying, don't worry. Don't worry. Don't take anxiousness, don't take anxiety and move it to the place to where you're so fretting and you're so, micro-focused on trying to get the necessities for life. God cares about the very small details of our lives. Verse 32 says, for after all these things the Gentiles seek. And here's the point that I want to magnify to you. For your heavenly Father knows that you need all these things. God knows that you need all these things. Caution point. So often that we can find that I've seen this in my years of ministry, and I've seen this in the nearly 7 years of pastoring here, even in this church. I've seen it not once, not twice, not 3 times. Maybe I've seen it a half a dozen times. It's that somebody is living their life and they're serving Jesus, they're following Jesus, okay? And you can just see that God is putting their life back together month after month, by year, by a couple of years maybe. And all of a sudden the blessings begin to come out of their life. And good job and restored marriage and kids are back on the ground and we got a new house and we got a new car and things are looking good. All of the trappings, all the things that God cares about in our life, everything comes back together. And then once those things come back together, then you find that there is a new dependency. And instead of this brokenness of following Jesus, there becomes this pursuit and care of the upkeep of the stuff. And the relationship with Jesus is backed off. And the next thing you know, the individual, though they have been blessed externally with a number of things, and God has been so gracious to put their life back together, they're back striving and struggling, and they turn the attention in the face, in their heart, from looking at God to the things. There's no longer time for fellowship. There's no longer time for service. There's no longer time for prayer. There's no longer time for individual reading of the scriptures. These are the caution points that I want to remind us of in a very practical way, because I'm hoping that as us as individuals and us as a unit, as a fellowship, that we've gone through a lot of trials, we've gone through a lot of struggles, but we've also seen a lot of blessings. And when God's love and his touch is upon your life and he's doing something that no man can explain, and his favor is there and something's going on, whatever it is that he's doing within your life, might I encourage you not to forget him. Don't forget him. Well, whether it is the farmer, the planting, sowing, or whether it's the merchant ships that are going out and Solomon's sending grain across the ocean as this investment and all this stuff, whatever it is, the simplicity of the way that this stuff falls down to us is it's just calling us to continue to live by faith. Think with me for just a second. As we look into the Old Testament scriptures, we go into the book of Samuel, 1 Samuel chapter 14 thereabouts, that we find Jonathan, Saul's son. That one day Jonathan and his armor bearer are there and they're doing their thing, and they see a small garrison of Philistines, and there they are. And Jonathan talks to his armor bearer, and he says, you know what, man, let's go up and get those suckers, man. Let's see if God's with us today. Just a super radical, courageous step of faith of going out. When we turn our attention to the New Testament, we find here that diving into the New Testament, we find in Acts chapter 16 that Paul was exercising the same type of faith, right? But if you remember with me, Paul went on that second missionary journey here in Asia Minor. As he went all across Asia Minor, you remember that he made his way to the north and over to the east, and he started trying to knock on all these doors once and twice and 3 times and maybe 4 times. Closed door, closed door, closed door, closed door. It wasn't happening. And then all of a sudden there was an open door. And then that great Macedonian call, as it's put, and Paul found exactly where the Spirit of God wanted him to go. Christian, I want you to remember this, that someone has once said this, that it's so much easier to steer a moving car as opposed to trying to steer a parked car. The steps of faith that we find within the Scriptures, within the Old Testament and New Testament alike, are very real. Taking steps of faith. In our text, it was about casting your bread upon the waters. It was about understanding that, wait a minute, there's going to be real struggles and real circumstances that are here, but don't just sit around. Keep going. Keep stepping out. Keep trusting the Lord. And the final portion of that I would say was, I would remind you about Abraham. That the magnification that comes out of what God did in Abraham's life, somewhere Genesis 12, 13, 14, 15, and then even beyond that, that God began to speak to Abraham, and we know that Abraham in the Scriptures, he's called the father of faith. But Hebrews chapter 11, verse number 8, it tells us this very specifically about Abraham. Is that it says this, is that he stepped out not knowing where he was going. That God was leading him in the moment. Now that tells me something pretty crazy here as I get a picture, a couple from the Old Testament, a little bit from the New Testament, that I'm finding that there's lives of faith and never the ideal or the perfect circumstance that is there. It's not. 2 weeks ago here, Calvary Chapel had a senior pastors conference out there in Southern California. And by show of hands, is anybody familiar with the pastor Greg Laurie out of California? Okay. Oh, a number of you guys are. Great. Greg Laurie said this. He's standing out before the senior pastors, and he says this. He says, "We're never going to gain spiritual ground if we keep playing it safe." I find that to be something that is super applicable within our time, because it seems like the Christian majority have gone to this place of becoming silent with their mouth. Listen, we're never going to gain spiritual ground if we keep playing it safe. There is a risk that is involved in being a Christian. There is, an open life. I just want to leave that at that. I don't want to dive too heavy in that because it's so easy for me to put like a trip on, and that's not my intention, and that's definitely not God's intention. But I will say this, is that I believe that God still wants to do some amazing things. And I think that he wants to continue to do amazing things right up till the time that he either takes us home or comes back, or however that all is going to work out. I don't know. I'm hoping to go in the rapture, okay? I don't know if I need papers for that, but, I'm signed, sealed, and delivered by the blood of Christ. Let's go. Done. But we learn with every passing day to lean on his faithfulness. And as we lean on his faithfulness, taking steps of faith become a natural byproduct of just walking with Jesus. And that's what I want to encourage you guys, is that you would continue to walk with Jesus. Now, I don't want to be absent-minded of our text, because in these first 6 verses, follow me with your eyeball, in these first 6 verses, that he uses the phrase, "You do not know." Look with me. Verse number 2, part B. He says, "For you do not know what evil will be on the earth." Follow your eyes all the way down, following a little farther. Verse 5, first part of verse 5. He says, "As you do not know what is the way of the wind." And look down there in part B. He says, "So you do not know the works of God who makes everything." And even also in verse number 6, part B, he says, for you do not know which will prosper, either this or that, or whether both alike will be good. We don't know. We don't know. And I think that on a practical day-by-day basis, I think that we can get stuck because we forget how to hear God's voice. We forget. And I want to remind you, whether you're a seasoned veteran in here that has walked with Jesus for a long time, or you're just learning how to walk with Jesus, I want to read a couple lines here, maybe a little more than a couple lines, from a book that I was just given at a pastor's breakfast. It's Sidetracked in the Wilderness is the title. Finding the Way Back to a Victorious Abundant Life by Michael Wells. I don't know who this author is. I don't know anything about this dude. I got the book as a gift, and I just started reading the book. And so I found it so far to be like right on. It's pretty awesome. But there's a section in here, I want to read it to you. It says this. It says, how does one get in his will? How does one get into God's will? The process is really quite simple. When alternatives arise, one must say, Lord, I want your will, not mine. I've decided to move to such and such a place. Lord, if this is your will, please close. If this is not your will, please close the door. If it remains open, I will move ahead with confidence. And he says that a friend reminded him wisely, and he advises him that after he prays, and after he's made a decision, he says that you should prayerfully wait for 7 days before acting. Why? Giving God a chance to close the door in case it's not his will. He goes on. He says many people struggle over prayer, not knowing how to pray or how to hear God. They lie on the floor waiting for God to speak, or they give up in frustration, having a one-sided communication with him. Prayer is simple. Listen to this. This is why I'm reading this. Prayer is simple. The talking part comes as we let our request be made known to God. The hearing part comes as we rest before him very quietly. Watch, Christian. Very quietly, slowly reading Scripture and allowing the Holy Spirit to speak. God's voice will not be human. It's not going to be audible. It's not going to be loud. It's not going to be overwhelming. And it's not going to be a supernatural movement in the emotions. It will be very simply God's voice, easily recognized by all of his sheep. I think we forget the simplicity in that, of laying our request before the Lord and then looking and waiting and listening as we go and we travel through the Scriptures. It's not about gaining more technical details within the nuances of the verse and the language and all of that stuff, although that is helpful. But we must understand that Jesus has come to give us life and to give it to us more abundantly. And this is not about health, wealth, and happiness. It's about a personal, close, vibrant relationship where God is with you, where God is for you, where God is walking with you through the affairs and the details of your daily life. And you sense and you see, because you're walking and abiding in the Lord, that the fruit is coming out of your life. If I was to poll this audience and ask who in this room wants less peace in your life, I don't think I'd get anybody that would raise their hand. But if I said who wants more peace in your life, listen, I'm throwing up both of my hands, my toes, my feet. I don't know what else, you get what I'm saying here, right? Man, we want more peace within our life. And part of the fruit of the Spirit is love and joy and peace and patience and kindness. I need all of that. Without Jesus, I have none of that. And because I have none of that, I become very abrasive. And so often I think that the very life that Jesus has come to give, I think, listen, I'm just a simple man. I'm wired to run 100 miles an hour, and I'm not sure that's all of Jesus. I think a lot of it is my own sinful ways. But I know that I get your eyes open looking for the big thing. God's working in the small things. God's working in the incremental things. God is very faithful to do what he is doing. And our lives are changed, man. Point 2, and we'll close very rapidly with this. Point 2 is this is enjoyment. Verses 7 down through 10 here. It's kind of super simple the way he closes it out. Let me read it and then I'll come back. He says, truly, the light is sweet and it is pleasant for the eyes to behold the sun. But if a man lives many years and he rejoices in them all, yet let him remember the days of darkness. What? For they will be many. All that is coming is vanity. Rejoice, O young man, in your youth, and let your heart cheer you in the days of your youth. Walk in the ways of your heart and in the sight of your eyes. But know that for all of these God will bring you into judgment. Therefore remove sorrow from your heart and put away evil from your flesh. For childhood and youth are vanity. And there's a sweet picture that is attached within this because it's powerful. But from verse 7 all the way down to chapter 12, about verse 6 or 7 or so, there's 3 parts that are within here. Verses 7 and 8 in our current chapter, chapter 11, this talks about enjoying life with an eye on the future. Okay? The light is sweet and it is pleasant for the eyes to behold the sun. I don't know how you feel. I know that since I've moved to Colorado that I find a lot of people, my son-in-law is one of these, that they absolutely love snow days and storms and all that stuff. I hate them. My bones hurt. I get cranky. I feel sad. I get depressed. I don't know. I could never live in Seattle. I hear they have a lot of not so much good days there. And so I'm in Colorado for sunshine, I guess. And if I can't be here, I'm going to the Bahamas or back to California. I'm not excited about being with the fruits and nuts in California, but the sunshine is what I like, okay? That's my deal. I like the sunshine because my body hurts less. As I get older, I'm going to have to get me a racing wheelchair and be a snowbird and go down to Arizona because there's some warmness there, right? I need that in my life. But the point is what he gives here in this, the movement of this is that the enjoyment of life, that it should start early, enjoying life, but understanding. He says, yet let him remember, verse 8, halfway through, he says, yet let him remember the days of darkness, for they will be many. All that is coming is vanity. His point is this. I think it sounds super dramatic here in the English, but the idea is this: is that enjoy life and understand that you're fixing to go into eternity. That everybody will move into eternity. So enjoy life, but do it wisely. And then he gives this little picture here in verse number 9 of the second step, enjoying life. Starting young is the second thing here in verse number 9. He says, rejoice, O young man, in your youth. So the important part is enjoying life, starting to enjoy life when you're young. I'm telling you, there is a way as parents that we can train up our kids not to enjoy life from the very earliest of age. I love my life. I think God has given me a wonderful life, but I'll tell you that there are practices, there are thoughts, there are patterns, habits, if that's the right word, that I have from the earliest of my days that sometimes they're not so fun, and it keeps me from enjoying something. More recently, I had my mom out here this past weekend. I had a chance to enjoy my mom, and a great visit. I was so stoked to see her this time. But we both laughed at one point in time because I forgot what we did. It's like she walked by something in the house, and she did one of these numbers here. She did just was like messing with me type of thing, and she knows that I'll come over there and I'll go like this. It goes that way, And she did it on purpose, okay? So she was messing with me. But the point is that I'm this way because when I grew up, our living room was a museum. You didn't go in there. You didn't sit on the couch in there. You didn't look at the china. My brother and I weren't always so good about this. In fact, on one Mother's Day, Mom, if you're watching, you'll remember this. On one Mother's Day, my brother was messing with me, and I took an orange off the table as trying to be a nice, kind brother. My mom was walking away, and my brother was giving me some jazz, and so I took that orange and I hurled it at him down the hall, right behind Mom's back, right? I thought I was going to tag him. I didn't. I hit the china cabinet, and it blew up. Oh, my goodness. I had to hit the door and run fast. Anyways, my brother did it, not me. Oh, man. I have no idea what that has to do with the study, but I do know this, that, listen, the Solomon here, he laid out early on ways to enjoy life. And the ways that he talked about enjoying life, I think they're okay. I think they're good. within their context. Let me remind you of those particular things. That he spoke about the sensual desires. Let me put some flavor on that, of eating and drinking, that this is good. He talked about it in chapter 2, chapter 3, chapter 8, chapter 9, eating and drinking. He spoke about smelling good. He mentioned these lotions and stuff. Maybe we would call it cologne and perfume today in chapter 9. He talked about marital bliss in chapter 9, maybe sexual intimacy and things of this nature. And so he put all these sensual desires on there. And again, within their proper context, they're absolutely fine, they're absolutely right. But when they began to move beyond their proper context and they began to control the way that we're doing things, then they move into what the New Testament calls, 1 John chapter 2, the lust of the flesh. The things that dominate our senses, that move us into areas that are out of step, that are out of balance, that have become so self-absorbing that they move us away from a dependent relationship upon God to almost like an addictive relationship to, I've got to have this to have my senses satisfied. Solomon also gave us, in that aspect of speaking about enjoying of life, he spoke about wearing nice clothes in chapter 9, verse 8. Again, there's nothing wrong with that. The finer things of life, if we make it our chief aim, and we begin to pursue the lust of the eyes, then we've taken it outside of the balance of what it has been intended for. And the final thing that he would share about is finding satisfaction in our work. He did it in chapter 2, in chapter 3, chapter 5. All of these things, finding satisfaction within the work that we do. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But when we move it to the place of self-sufficiency and a place of power, then all of a sudden pride of life sets in. So being very careful that we don't fall to the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life within the very things that are right around our daily life. The daily life, the daily things that God has given to us can either be a blessing or a curse, depending upon if it controls your life or if you have it yielded up to the Lord in your life. He's given you all things to enjoy, but if it takes you captive to where it dominates mind, emotions, circumstances, and drives, then you're outside of the spectrum of what God has called us to. What's the point? Overindulgence. And the caution is that he's given is enjoy life, start enjoying it early. Yes, 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 yes. If you lead a reckless life, verse 9, in your youth, and you just go wild, and these are the habits and the fragrances that become yours all the way through your life, please understand, he says that, but know that for all these, God will bring you into judgment. You will have to give account. Now, for us as Christians, and this is my second close. We're closing. We're done. But I'm just stirring up your pure mind real fast. 2 Corinthians chapter 5. Don't go there. I'll just read it to you. Verse number 9 and 10. Paul writes to those that were in Corinth. He says, therefore, we make it our aim, whether present or absent, to be well-pleasing to him. For we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, that each one may receive the things done in the body according to what he has done, whether good or bad. This is the bema seat. This is where Christians are not appearing before the Lord. We're not going to stand before the Lord, for judgment, punitive measures. No, we are standing before the judgment seat of Christ, the bema seat of Christ, technical word here, to receive rewards, to what we did with our life, to how we invested our life and so forth. The non-believers will stand before the great white throne judgment, and they will give account and they will give judgments, receive judgments, for all the sinful things that were done and so forth. And the idea behind this is that if we live reckless and we just, you go out there in your youth and you begin to live that way and you carry that all the way through, please understand that you're going to give account to God. So what happens, verse 10? Therefore, remove sorrow from your heart and put away evil from your flesh. What does that mean? He's dealing with the internal stuff and the external stuff. Get rid of the anxiety and get rid of the physical stuff that moves you in the wrong direction. And he closes it off. For childhood and youth are vanity. If we're not brought up through the ages of our youth and we're not taught the right way to go, if childhood is left unchecked, then the habits and the practices and the things that we develop from an early age most often are contrary to Christ. So I want to encourage you with this. I would love for the realities of what we've seen within this chapter to keep you anchored and to keep you dependent upon Jesus. And then independently and then together that we would learn how to do good in your own personal life. It might start very small, and that's okay. That's fine. But please understand that you need to do something with your life. Don't just sit there like a bump on the log. Remember, guys, we're well beyond talking about the salvation stuff, okay? That's not the context of what we're looking at here tonight. But we are talking about living life within step and investing our lives for what God has given unto us. We've only got one life to live. Investing it for Christ and bringing Christ into the things that you do on a daily basis. I tell you, that's enough to keep us busy all the days of our life for sure. God is good. God desires to be a part of it.
Thanks for joining us today. If you want to know more about having a real relationship with God, click the Do You Know Him link at westminstercalvary.org. We also would like to invite you to join us for our regular weekly services on Sundays at 8:30 and 10 a.m. or Wednesdays at 6:30 p.m. We are conveniently located on the northeast corner of Wadsworth Parkway and Church Ranch Boulevard in the Stanley Lake Marketplace Shopping Center. For more information, please contact our church offices at 303-223-4640. Thanks and God bless.
Heaven is hidden in our hearts. You're in our hearts. You're in our hearts. You've broken our hearts. For innocent blood. He showed His love. Taking the cross for us. No greater love. An innocent blood. As He showed His love. Taking the cross for us. No greater love. An innocent blood.